Subscribe now for a chance to win a $20 Amazon gift card at the end of the month. All you gotta do is stay subscribed and comment on the video and the card above. The Boy and Girl Scouts are brave souls, venturing door to door or into the woods, barely escaping from monsters and murderers alike. This world is a strange one. Entering the Scouts is a great way to learn skills to help you survive and live anywhere. Plus, the Girl Scouts is a fantastic way to get into the cookie dealing business. But when you're not enabling people's cookie addictions, you might be in the middle of a strange place, learning new things. All the while, someone or something is preying upon you. So, to the brave boys and girls out there, I salute you and wish you luck. Enjoy these allegedly true Boy Scout and Girl Scout scary stories. But first, if you've got a Craigslist story or a Tumblr horror story, I'd love to hear it and maybe even feature it in a new video. Just go to darknessprevails.org to share your story today. Now, are you ready to earn your I almost freaking died badge? Number 1. Monster in Maine. Submitted by Joe K. I am in the Boy Scouts, and my troop, which is from New Jersey, recently ventured to Maine for summer camp. The first day we checked in and got into our cabins. The cabins weren't new, but that was better. They had those old screen doors and windows. It seemed rustic and genuine. There were bunk beds on opposite corners of the cabins. I got bottom bunk, so I could see the door while my other 4 buddies got the others. One night I had to go pee, and still being scared of the dark at the time, I woke up one of my friends so he could come with me. While I was doing my business, my friend looked the other way to give me some privacy. So when it happened, he didn't see what I think I saw. Whatever it was, I almost mistook it for a tree, because the branches or the arms of this thing had different lengths. I looked away, then looked at the same place again. But it had moved. It wasn't in the same place now. I never saw it move, but I knew it had, and I tried not to think too much of it. I was kind of creeped out in the dark anyway. I was praying that my eyes were just playing tricks on me. So I finished up, and we both headed back to the cabin. The next night, after I was deep asleep, I woke up in the middle of the night with the strongest and strangest feeling that someone was watching me. It was one of those times when you wake up and know you're not going back to sleep, except this time, I saw something that made me want to scream as loud as I possibly could. But I stopped myself because I thought if I did scream, I would die. The door of our cabin opened both ways, push or pull, and I could see something outside the door, moving closer towards it. The silhouette of whatever it was looked exactly like the tree thing from the night before. I felt like I had to do something. Who knows what it would do if it got in the cabin? So I forced myself up, and I moved my footlocker in front of the door to prevent it from opening. But whatever that thing was outside the door, it never even tried to open it. It just stared at me, and I was literally petrified. I couldn't move until that thing finally left. I watched its massive asymmetrical silhouette walk away slowly back into the woods. A few minutes after I couldn't see it anymore, I finally walked slowly back to bed. In shock from the whole ordeal, I laid there eyes wide, staring at the bunk above me, wondering what the heck was going on. No one had ever told me or prepared me for something like this. The next morning, I was hesitant to get up, but when I finally did, I ran outside to where the thing had been standing, and I looked down to see tracks. These tracks had 4 toes and what looked to be a claw on the back of the heel. I expected to see them up to the door and then leave down back into the woods. But I saw that they circled around the cabin several times. This creature, all night, it must have been watching us, observing us, through nothing but screen windows. I didn't tell my scoutmaster because I knew he wouldn't believe me. And the very next night, I was begging my friend for the top bunk. I thought it would make me feel safer. Once we traded, in the morning my friend told me he saw something. He said he saw the strangest looking animal he's ever seen. I thought about my reply for a second, and I ended up saying that I did not believe him. but I think I was just trying to keep him from getting as scared as I was. But I did believe him, and I will never forget what I saw. Number 2. Cookies or Creeps. Submitted by Nova Lee. Are you sure you want to spend the night? My mother had asked. We were supposed to go to some Girl Scouts event together, but I had been at my Girl Scout friend Carly's house all day, and she was begging me to stay the night. Carly and I looked at each other. This had been the first time I'd been to her house. I was 7, and it gave me pounding anxiety to even think of spending my time somewhere with a new friend. Though the both of us spent hours together at school, somehow this was different. Silently, we agreed. It would be an unofficial Girl Scout sleepover. Yes, I do, I replied casually. Then I moved to the couch. All right, honey. I'll be back over with some of your clothes in a little bit. I love you. Bye. My mom smiled and left. Okay, so what do we do now? Carly asked, both of us sitting on the couch. You want to watch some YouTube? She stood up, turning on a computer of some sort, and typing something in. After a while watching some YouTube videos, another girl came by. I don't exactly remember her name, so let's just call her Jane. Jane seemed a bit older than the both of us. Apparently another scout though. She brought some food and we continued to watch YouTube together, until Carly left the room to get something. I sat in the middle of the room, next to the fireplace, because I was shivering. It's not that cold in here, Jane remarked, which was odd because I felt freezing. Then Carly came back. She was holding a rather large piece of cardboard, a quarter and a marker. She sat on the carpet and began to draw something. I had no idea what it was, but I now recognize it as a makeshift Ouija board. Nova, she said. Put your hand on this, she told me after drawing out the Ouija board. Then she placed the quarter in the middle. She said a few ritualistic-sounding words, and then began to ask questions. Questions about random stuff, like what we had for breakfast and what the demon's name was. We played that for a while. The whole time I swear it was getting colder by the minute, and something just felt wrong. When we were bored of that, Carly put on a movie, and we made a bet. Whoever was to fall asleep first was going to get whipped cream on their face. Of course, Jane fell asleep first, but we really didn't do it. We weren't that cruel. Soon Carly fell asleep too, and I was the last to pass out. We all woke up at the same time, with freezing cold water on our faces. Mind you, before we ever fell asleep, we were teasing each other about ghost or demon boyfriends, Zach, Jake, or Isaac, etc. But deep down, the whole Ouija board and demon thing really scared me. Jane quickly dismissed it and went back to sleep, while Carly and I, too afraid to go to the bathroom alone, went together, only to rush back after we were done, to find Jane covered in Mountain Dew and still sleeping. This was weird. If it was a prank, I knew Carly wasn't doing it. She had been with me. And if Jane had poured Mountain Dew on herself to get at us, it was a bit much for such a messy prank. So eventually we went to sleep again, thinking it was nothing and just a cruel prank played by one of us, or I guess I was hoping it was a prank. But we woke up again later in the night, this time covered in warm water. I didn't know exactly what was happening, but it brought me to tears. I swear I woke up to the feeling of someone's hands on me once, only to see that there was no one around me. We all forced ourselves to sleep, and the next day when I left, I never came back. I was never going to spend another night at Carly's. Number 3. Werewolf in the Woods. Submitted by PIANOMAN. Let me start off with some background info. I'm 13 now and this happened when I was 10. My family owns about 200 acres of dense forest, and every year we let a Boy Scout troop do a turkey cookout on our land. It's all good fun. One day my dad, brother, and I were preparing for the cookout. I believe it was around November. The scouts were there and camping, and my dad and brother were going to join them, but I wasn't. At one point that evening, we were bringing supplies up with a four-wheeler and an old trailer for the scout troop. The path has many rocks, and the trailer doesn't go very fast on this path. The path itself is about a quarter mile, and takes about 15 minutes to get from start to finish. We got there at about 3 o'clock and had a little fun with the scout members, which I'm friends with. We were there until about 9 o'clock when we decided that it was time to head back. It was quite dark, except for the full moon, slightly lighting up the woods brighter than usual that night. My brother likes to carry around a BB gun, which he had with him strapped to his shoulder this night. My brother and I were in the trailer, and my dad was driving. I'm not a big fan of being in the woods at night, but I'm definitely going to think twice after this night. We were going about 8 miles per hour. Like I said earlier, this trailer can't drive very fast on this path at all. After a few minutes of driving, I began to hear soft thuds in the woods. I start to look around, expecting to see someone. It sounded like it was coming from a large animal, a person or maybe a bear. The thuds repeated for a few minutes, and no, it started to sound like footsteps. I was almost certain it was a person. Whatever the thuds were, it was getting closer. Once again, I tried looking for whatever was making these thuds. What I saw next almost gave me a heart attack. A creature, running on 2 legs covered with hair with glowing eyes, was running through the woods on the side of the path. It was only about 100 feet away. I yelled for my dad to hit the gas and to drive faster. He asked me what was going on, and I yelled back to just drive fast. My heart was pounding, and I've never been so scared before in my life. The creature began to get closer and closer. My fear got the better of me, and I grabbed my brother's BB gun. It was already pumped, and I took a shot at it. The trailer was bumpy, so I missed. I pumped the BB gun fast. I tried another shot, but this time I got it, whatever it was, because it just stopped dead in its path. I turned around again, and I told my dad once more to step on it. And when I looked back, it was standing on 2 legs and was looking directly at me. My brother saw it and screamed, asking what the heck that was. I didn't reply. I was so focused on this creature. It had to have been 7 feet tall, with long arms and pointy ears. My dad finally listened though, flooring it. We got home in about 2 more minutes. My dad asked what the issue was, kind of upset that he had to risk the trailer just to speed up. I told him there was something dog-like with lots of fur and was about 7 feet tall. My dad agreed that I saw something, especially after my brother screamed, but not that it was 7 feet tall. My dad called the Scoutmaster's cell and even warned them about the creature that I saw. They said they'll keep an eye out for it. After that, my dad and my brother stayed at the house. I didn't sleep a wink that night. The next morning, the Scoutmaster came down to our house. He told us that they had heard howls a couple of times during the night. He also said, on his way down here, he saw large footprints that looked like a wolf's. These were Boy Scouts. They know their footprints and study them. And what really puts chills up my spine is that it may have resembled a wolf, but he said that there was no exact match for it. At that point, he looked as scared as I was. What the Scoutmaster said that day and what I saw, it still scares me, and hopefully I will forget about my encounter with this so-called werewolf. And I'm very sure that that night was definitely a full moon. And number 4, The Alligator Beast, submitted by Weston B. I can say flat out, I only know one other person who's seen what I saw, and she refuses to talk about it. There is local lore, though, about a monster living in the river, but the description doesn't seem to match up completely with what was reported several decades ago. I would have thought I was hallucinating, had it not been for how vivid the experience was. Over the years where I live, there have been several encounters with this thing, and all seem to be the same type of being, or maybe even the same individual. I'm currently 18 years old, and I'm an intern part-time at a paleontology museum while I'm enrolled in college to work towards a degree in zoology and paleontology over the next 10 years. I know it doesn't sound like the most experienced or trustworthy credentials, but I can say safely I have absolutely nothing to gain from any of this, as you will be the first people I've told who aren't involved. The first sighting was 3 years ago in mid-March during spring break. It wasn't as much what I saw as I saw what likely was left by it. I live on a canal system that feeds directly onto a large river system that spans mostly to the eastern side of Florida called the St. Johns River Delta. Often wildlife that lives in the river frequently come up into the canals for a number of reasons. Fishing birds, dolphins, game fish, manatees, even bull sharks and alligators on occasion. It's brackish water due to the river meeting the ocean, fairly shallow, about 5 feet deep in most spots, but so full of silt and natural particles that it's nearly impossible to see through. It's so dark that some people call it the Black Tea River. Unless an object is less than 3 inches from the surface, it's impossible to see, and if it's more than a foot underwater, you can't even see the outline of it. I was out on my dock rinsing off my family's small sailboat. It was a fairly good day, only a few thick clouds and a lot of sunshine. I had just finished when I saw a manatee drift over, attracted to the sound of the water. They like to drink the hose water, so I turned the setting down, slung the hose over the side of the dock to let it drink. It was moving a bit oddly, but as soon as it rolled over onto its back to drink, I noticed its front flipper had several very deep bite marks on it in a U-shaped pattern. Now, manatees have no natural predators due to their bulk and very tough hide, so I'd never seen one with bite marks like that before. Usually all scars or injuries are from boat propellers, and the way this mark was set, I know that wasn't possible. This was definitely a bite mark. The tooth marks were conical shaped, in a narrow row. I know it couldn't have been a shark because when they bite, they leave thin lines with dashes for each tooth. Alligators have peg-like teeth that are cone-shaped, but save for incredibly large bull gators, 12 to 15 feet long, they aren't bold enough or even big enough to attack a manatee. And large males simply don't even live in the brackish water. They prefer swamps and freshwater springs. The only alligators I'd seen in the river and canal were juveniles, at maximum 5 feet long. This manatee looked like it had been attacked recently. The poor animal was riddled with cuts and bites, with a chunk of its tail flipper missing. There was nothing too deep or lethal considering how dense sea cow muscle is, so nothing caused massive bleeding. But the point still stood. Something big enough to attack a 1-ton sea cow was in the river system. Hairs on the back of my neck were standing up at the thought of it. Later that day, when we took the boat out to the river for a ride, I kept getting this odd feeling, like I was being watched. But I blew it off, as there were other people on the water boating. Eventually, we docked on this small island. I was accustomed to this place. Usually, I saw a lot of pelicans and egrets nest there. But despite it being near nesting season, I didn't see a single bird in those mangroves. It only added to the eeriness that day. Looking around, they were there, but they were on other shores, not on this island, as if they were avoiding this place. And then I stumbled upon recently broken and snapped off branches that were originally up to my height or higher. It wouldn't make sense for it to be hunters, because there were no game birds on the small island, and most tourists avoided this spot because the mangroves were very dense and the terrain was rough. Besides, entire colonies of birds wouldn't abandon raccoon and possum-free habitats because of 1 or 2 people walking around. I couldn't see any tracks because of how many fallen leaves there were, but I did see sliding marks that were too angular and curved to be a boat on a patch of sand on the far side of the island. That bad feeling of being watched was back, and because it was getting dark, I decided to go back to the boat and head home. A year later, in early June, I was out in River Lakes Conservation Park in my Boy Scout troop, a large cluster of swamp, lakes, savanna, and forest that borders along waterways that connect to the St. Johns River on the mainland side of the river. I lived on the island side. It was about 7 p.m. and getting dark fast, and I was walking back to camp after tramping around. But to get back, I had to go around a large patch of marsh. The sun was beginning to set, but it was still fairly bright out, thanks to a minimal overcast. Though it got dark in many spots due to how thick the forest got. I can't recall much about the animals I saw, but I noticed as soon as I got to the edge of the marsh, I didn't notice any birds or game, and everything went silent, unnaturally so. Just before setting foot in that marsh, I had seen deer in the woods, a lot of songbirds. I even heard a bobcat yowling, but there was none of that here, which I thought was very unsettling at the time, because the marshes are often rich with fauna. I was circling around the marsh and crossing under a thicket of pine trees when I heard something in the water make a small splash. I thought it was a fish at first, so that's why I didn't pay much more mind to it. But then out of nowhere and for no reason, I got that same feeling, an unsettling feeling that made me nervous. I was about to pick up my pace when I heard something in the water shift, with what I think was a small hiss. I looked over just in time to catch a glimpse of a blackish figure standing under some cypress trees. It ducked down into the water when I looked. Whatever it was aware of me. I couldn't make out the form much, but it was standing in at least 4 foot deep water and was several feet high when I saw it. So it was big. I think it was maybe at its waist, but the outline just didn't look right for a person. It was maybe 60 feet away from me, and the way it dived underwater seemed like it was heading towards me. When that thought crossed my mind, I nearly lost it and ran back to camp as fast as I could. After that experience with the Boy Scouts, over the next year or two, I'd occasionally hear a sound in the woods at night. Whenever I'd go out with the troop again, I would hear similar things. It was usually distant and far away, but I could at many times make out bellows or hisses that sounded like nothing I'd ever heard before. The Boy Scouts taught us how many vocalizing species live in that area, like bobcats, coyotes, and several owls. So I would try to ignore it, thinking it was one of those animals making a weird sound. It's been a while since my time in the Boy Scouts, and I still remember that night so clearly. I have nightmares of wandering out of our scout camp, getting lost, and being stalked by that thing. I always wondered but never asked if any of my fellow Boy Scouts saw that thing too. Maybe I just didn't want to sound crazy. Just last month, I had needed to go out and exercise as well, to see some of the manatees, since they were just now coming out of their winter retreats and going back into the river and canals. It was a fairly clear day with some distant clouds, so I took my kayak out to my dock, rowed it out of the canals and into the river mouth. I paddled until I spotted a small inlet along the side of the river that wasn't fully developed. Usually the manatees in the area converged in spots like this due to the calm water and ample food. I've been to the spot plenty of times with plenty of success. After crossing the bend, I finally reached the lagoon, and I could see the kick marks of a sea cow a short distance ahead. Since their tail fluke is so broad and they swim so close to the surface, they displace a lot of water, so they leave broad, round disturbances in the water surface, called kick marks. What struck me as odd, though, that it was about noon, and they were already leaving the lagoon at a very fast pace. They usually stay in the lagoon and canals during the day, and they would move out at late evening, 6 to 8 o'clock. I was watching this manatee leave and ignored it. Maybe he was the odd one out that was breaking the norm. The lagoon was pleasant enough to look at, and the woods around them were calm, so I rowed in anyways. I was getting tired of all that rowing, so I set my oar down. I pulled out some water to have a drink. In hindsight, I probably should have noticed that there were no birds present there, something very strange for that time of year. It was always very creepy when nature suddenly went silent. I was just finishing my drink when something bumped the bottom of my kayak. I was motionless in the water, so I knew if something bumped me, it had to be moving. I wasn't startled because I've been bumped by a lot of things before, like moving underwater logs, or young bull sharks taking an exploratory bump to see if it's food or not, maybe even a large fish or manatees. Manatees often do this to scratch their backs. I assumed it was a manatee since I was in that lagoon, and I got excited. I looked over the edge and I did see a dark shape about the length of a sea cow. It swam away though before I could positively ID it. I glimpsed it turning around due to a disturbance it caused on the water surface, and sure enough, I felt a second bump. The sound of the bump was all wrong. If it was a manatee scratching its back, there's only a single gentle bump and maybe a small sliding sound. But this, it sounded more like something hard moving over an old washing board, or running your knuckles over your ribs with a successive series of bumps. That was when I got spooked. I know my animals, and I know manatees, dolphins, and bull sharks. They don't do that, and they don't feel like that. Now I could just barely see the outline that was at least as long as my kayak, 14 feet, and it was notably broader for the first 2/3 before tapering off. It moved out from under my kayak, and I decided it was best to get out of the water as fast as I could. As the shore was sandy and only 10 feet away, I took the chance, and I rapidly rowed myself over there as fast as the boat could go. I beached the kayak and jumped out, and I ran back a short distance as I watched the shape head to another part of the shore, about 20 feet away. As it reached the shallower water that was partially see-through against the white sand, I could see whatever it was looked like a gator, since it had a scaly body and scutes coming down its back. That would really explain the rapid series of bumps under the boat, since each skewed has a bony lump in the center. That said, since it had to be a large male gator, I backed up about another 3 yards from the shore. These things can lunge out several yards out of the water very fast, but not over a distance. I continued to watch, and something just seemed wrong. The alligator was the same color as normal, jet black with that tint of blue. But when it surfaced, the head seemed weird. Crocodilians have a very broad but very flat skull, whereas this thing seemed to have a skull that was much taller vertically. Its elbows stuck out further, even passing the top of its body in profile. And that's not right, because gators have very short arms. It was crawling ashore, and the more it revealed itself, the more un-gator it looked like. I could see the arms as it crawled ashore, and they were far bigger than normal, with very obvious muscle mass showing through the scales. The fingers were also longer than normal, but I couldn't tell what was a claw and what was a scale. Its legs were so broad and thick, and it held them more like a mammal, and that they were directly below the body rather than off to the sides like a reptile. When it lifted itself off the ground fully, I could tell the limbs were definitely longer than normal, at least twice the length. It was almost like looking at a dragon. I don't know how it saw me, maybe through scent or eyesight through its peripheral vision, but it swung its head around and looked right at me. I could feel the blood rushing out of my face. I could see this animal's build, and I knew without a doubt that it could probably run fast enough to catch me. It dug its forelimbs down like it was doing a push-up, and it raised up on its hind legs. It forced its arms up, and it began to stand upright like a bear, while still glaring at me. I tried to scream, but I couldn't even get it out of my throat. This animal reared up and was at least 6.5 feet to 7 feet tall, with a very heavy build. It was completely unlike anything I've ever seen. School, college, Boy Scouts, nothing prepared me for this. Nothing gave mention of something like this. The underbelly from the lower jaw to the base of the tail was a whitish yellow color. I could see its pectoral bones and muscle through its chest. Its tail, though, did look like a normal alligator tail, and it was sticking out behind the body and slumped on the ground. It had no lips, and the teeth were visible, but like an alligator's, only the top jaw's fangs were out. There was no fur or feathers, just scales. I know when people think of upright walking animals, they think human-like, but this reptile seemed built more like a bear or an ape. It raised its arms up at the elbows and let out a hiss that sounded like a normal alligator, but much deeper. It opened its mouth slightly and briefly, making a short snarl before rattling its throat and letting out a bellow so deep I swear I could feel it. Before I could turn and run, it turned away from me and walked off into the woods. It took about 10 steps before it dropped down on all fours, then disappeared into the brush, but I could still hear it moving through the thicket for about a minute. I was just standing there in shock for a bit before I roped my kayak to a tree and ran to a nearby highway to follow home. It might have taken longer, but I did not want to risk getting in the water again with that thing around. It could have attacked me, but I think it gave me a warning. Later that day, the friend that went with me to pick up my kayak was staying over, and since we had company, she and I vouched earlier that week when we planned to get together to sleep in the sailboat, since it has 2 wide mattress benches inside the cabin. Though we did make these plans before I had my encounter. I hid my fear the best I could, but I was still absolutely reeling from getting near the water, and the fact it was so dark and raining only made it worse. We had a light rain shower blow through in bands, but the clouds weren't very thick, and since the moon was nearly full visibility, it was still good. The brightness that night made me feel a little bit better. After sealing the cabin door and turning out the lights at 10 o'clock, my friend got drowsy and she was out in about 10 minutes. But I was still awake for another hour. I was listening to the storm, and I was still very shaken about what happened. It was about 3 in the morning and I suddenly awoke for no apparent reason. It was still raining outside, but it began to lighten to more of a drizzle. Outside there were no other sounds besides the storm. Everyone was asleep and inside. I fell asleep, but was soon woke up by something. I thought maybe it was thunder, or the flash of light from lightning, or maybe even one of the house sensor lights going off due to a passing raccoon. So I sat up and looked out the portholes, but I didn't see anything, besides a distant streetlight obscured by a tree. Some minutes passed and I laid back down. And that's when I heard a hissing sound, and instantly my mind flashed back to my creature encounter. I was hoping and praying I wasn't right, that it wasn't the same animal from before. I looked back out the porthole facing the canal entrance, and I could see a figure in the dim light on the distant side of the canal. The rain was pinging off of its body. It made it easier to outline the shape, and I nearly felt like I'd have a heart attack when I realized it was the thing from earlier, and it was heading towards me. I can't explain how, but the thought just warped into my mind, almost like there was a feeling it had followed me home from the river. I was on the edge of screaming. This cabin had no weapons. I wasn't old enough to carry a firearm, and the house was so far away, and the creature was getting close fast. All that was between us was half an inch of plexiglass and maybe some old wood. I glanced out of the porthole again, quickly, and this thing was already next to my neighbor's sailboat, which must have been about 50 feet now. I was desperate. I shook my friend awake. It took a moment, but as soon as her eyes were open and looked behind me, she froze up, and her eyes widened in fear. I'd never seen her like that, and I didn't need to say a word. Suddenly, 2 thumps echoed throughout the deck. I looked back, and that creature was right up to the edge of the boat, peering inside through one of the glass portholes. It was just staring in. Its head was cocked downwards to a good degree, so that its eyes were facing toward us. We were both so afraid and terrified. We didn't move, out of fear that we may provoke it. All it would need to do was climb into the lower portion of the boat, which was only 2 feet away out of the water, and break or remove the plexiglass to be able to get to us. I just kept whispering to my friend over and over again to keep quiet and don't move. We stayed like that for some time, and all the while, that sense of dread never faded. It looked like it was observing us more than it was just looking at a meal, and it never tried to break in. The breathing of this animal was very loud, but not in the sense it sounded labored. It was only occasional, maybe once a minute. And the weirdest thing about this was that it had these amber or bronze-colored eyes. It stayed there for about 5 minutes before it let out this short grumble or snarl, and then it backed away from the boat at last. At first I was worried that it was going to circle around and crawl onto the deck, but it just backed up, turned around, then swam off into the storm. My friend and I were so scared that it was some sort of trap that we stayed in the boat until about 9 a.m. and ran back up to the house at that point. I used to go out on the river all the time. Now I'm afraid to step foot on the dock. That water is so dark, I would never see anything coming, and that to me is simply terrifying. Ever since I saw that creature in the Boy Scouts, it seems to have been following me. And since then, I've always wondered what might have happened if I never ran back to the camp that night, if I had just kept walking slowly enough for it to swim toward me. I wish I never went with the Boy Scouts that day. The Scout programs around you are there to help the community, to help young boys and girls to grow into mature and wise adults. But as we see in literally every other aspect of reality, there's always a chance that you may be attacked. Who knows what kind of psycho wants your cookies? Who knows what creatures are starving to eat the first human they see in the woods? And who knows what you're being watched by right now? Good night. Be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. And don't forget to send us your Craigslist and Tumblr horror stories at darknessprevails.org. Thanks.